So this final video is going to be a little bit different format. So this is a website that I discovered and has been made free to use due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is called Chem Compute. And we can do something very similar actually at Con in Mark's computer lab. We have copies of a program called Gaussian that does similar calculations as to what I'm about to do here. But the nice part about this is it's a web interface, so even though I'm at home recording these videos, I can access a much more powerful computer to do these calculations with. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to calculate the energy levels for one of these dimers. So in particular, I've picked a carbon dimer, C2. This has a nice web interface, so somebody's already drawn this for me. And we're going to go ahead and it'll optimize the structure to get it ready. All right, so it's ready to go, and we can see it shows it's a double bond diatomic molecule. We'll hit next, and we can set the parameters for a quantum mechanical calculation. All right, so we're going to optimize the geometry. That means it'll find what's the lowest possible energy we can get. And in this case, we only optimize the bond length. We're not going to worry about, but you can calculate things like the infrared spectrum and other things like that, but we're not going to worry about that. And then we get to pick our basis set. We'll talk about what these mean, particularly STO3G, 3-2G, these ones with the G labels. We'll talk about those specifically when we get to the computational chemistry chapter. In short, these are ways of representing the atomic orbitals as we combine them into molecular orbitals. Then we'll use B3-lip. All right. So for something as small as C2, it doesn't the parameters we pick don't really matter, especially since we don't care about whether we are, we just want a decent approximation. We don't need something that's really expensive that gets us really, really good results, but takes a long time. All right, so I'll submit this job. And so there's a server somewhere that is doing this calculation using a piece of software called Games, which is actually, it's a freely available piece of software that does computational chemistry calculations. The nice part is my laptop doesn't have to do this calculation. Something this small, it could. We can say it took 4.5 seconds of CPU time, which is nice, 0.1 minute. And what we're interested in is coming down here, visualization. So what we want to see, so this is our molecule here. We'll zoom in a little bit. So this is our little C2 dimer. It doesn't explicitly show the double bond anymore, but that's not particularly important. So it has a specific bond length that was optimized here. But what we're interested in is these orbitals and the energy units. These are in atomic units, so these are in Hartrees. So let's look at our orbitals. Our lowest energy orbital, these are going to be from our 1s electrons. And as I click on these, the orbital should pop up here. There we go. So the first lowest energy molecular orbital are combinations of our 1s electrons. And as I've mentioned previously in another video, we can see the 1s electrons are pretty much localized on their individual atoms. So they don't really these are almost like atomic orbitals, right? So, and we have another one where they'll be out of phase. So red indicates positive, blue will indicate negative. So we have another one where they're out of phase. But these electrons are pretty much localized on their carbon atoms. The orbital actually stretches across both atoms, which is interesting. But so then we'll get our 2s electrons in this next set. And so this is our 2s electrons forming a bonding orbital. All right, so we see the electron density shared across the two nuclei, and that there's no node, right? So we can kind of move this around, but there's no nodes anywhere in this. So that's what makes this a sigma orbital. We don't have a node along the plane, and there's no node in between this. So this is a sigma bonding orbital. So this is what we call a sigma G orbital. The next one up should be our sigma antibonding orbital from our 2s electrons. And once it loads, we'll see that that is the case. We have a node in between, and we have our two separate lobes, kind of our 2s orbitals sort of pushing away from each other a little bit. And this is our antibonding orbital made from the 2s electrons. And as we go up further, we'll get our 2p electrons. So according to our diagrams, we should next get the pi bonding orbitals. And there should be two of them. They're perpendicular to each other. And so we see two orbitals that have the exact same energy, negative 3.26 Hartrees. And this is our pi bonding orbital, right? So now we do have a node in the plane of the molecule, in the plane of the bond, I should say. And we have our lobe on the top and on the bottom. This would be a pi g or pi u orbital, a bonding pi orbital. And we have another one that's going to be at perpendicular to it at 90 degrees. So this is like our px combining and our py combining. So this one would be py because it's along the y-axis. And then our next orbital up should be our sigma bonding orbital that's formed from the pz electrons. And that's what we see. So this is our pz's combining. So we see we have this, we don't have a node in the plane of the bond anymore. So this is a sigma orbital, and it's bonding because we don't have a node in between. And we can see sort of this is the shape of two p orbitals added together. And as we keep going up, we should now get our antibonding orbitals. Then in carbon, these aren't occupied anymore in the carbon dimer. And we can see pretty much this exact same shape as what I drew, right? So we have a node in between and a node in the plane of the bond. So this is a pi g orbital, and we'll have another one at 90 degrees to that for the x, right? So these are degenerate. They have the same energy, but basically look exactly the same. And then our last one that we'll look at is our sigma antibonding orbital that's formed from the pz orbitals. And there we go. There it is. So we have a node between our molecules now, or between our atoms, our nuclei, that makes this an antibonding orbital. And we have these additional nodes because these are made from p electrons. So this is just a way to show that we can also calculate these using computational chemistry, and that it follows exactly what we have discussed in class. So the last thing I'll just mention briefly, and we'll discuss this a lot more in class, are diatomic molecules. It may seem like, we figured it out, we kind of know everything about them, but actually diatomic molecules are really interesting. You notice we didn't go further down in the periodic table. Once we add more electrons, things get a lot more complicated. And as I mentioned as well, things like beryllium dimer, according to this first order view that we've looked at in our class, there shouldn't be a bond, but it does actually form. And so in class we'll talk about some examples of continuing studies. I personally have studied diatomic molecules. I published a paper about calcium oxide, and we'll talk about that in class. So diatomic molecules are still a very active area of research, and understanding the electronic properties of molecules is something that's really interesting, and people are still doing.